Lasha, you just have to indicate to me when everybody's on the call.
I will do so, Prof.
Thank you. Lasha, are we struggling to get Advocate Omar Rabachi on the line?
Yes, Professor, we're just waiting for her to join us. I've just been in touch with her.
Okay, all right.
We can start. She's joined us. Thank you.
All right, good. All right, good afternoon to everyone that's dialed in on this particular webinar, the 2021 University of the Free State Thought Leadership webinar series. I'm Francis Peterson. I'm the Rector and Vice Chancellor of the University of the Free State, and it's really wonderful to have all of you being part of this call. Now, as a public higher education institution in South Africa, with a responsibility to contribute to public discourse, the University of the Free State is presenting this second webinar for 2021 as part of his Thought Leadership series, and also as part of the Vrystaat Literature Festival online initiative, the so-called Vryspraak Digital. So earlier this year, our webinar focused on reimagining universities for student success. Today's discussion is going to be touching on the corruption in South Africa, the endemic pandemic, a matter that remains topical, not only in the media and in the public discourse, and you're obviously all probably watching what's happening in the Zondo Commission, but it also in many other spheres of our society. So the scourge of corruption in South Africa has become endemic at all levels of the state and has radically accelerated the nation's descent from a position of credibility that it once occupied during the era of Nelson Mandela. And I just don't only want to link it to the state. We also obviously also aware that these sort of developments also happen in the private sector, and we therefore should not only focus on the state, but also on the private sector too. The economy is damaged. Many state-owned enterprises are rendered dysfunctional, while self-enrichment by some political party cadres continues unabated at the peril of stark poverty and deepening inequality of the broader population. And it's been said that corruption really impacts specifically and more drastically the poor, because a lot of those, the fact that if you are a corrupt state or corrupt environment, you also have an impact in terms of investment that would like to come into the country, and that all have impact on the economy and subsequently on all South Africans or all parts of the citizens, but specifically the poor. Now, are there grounds for optimism for South Africans? We have been deeply wounded by the state of the nation. We will hear different perspectives on this question from our panel. And I am actually quite delighted to introduce our esteemed panelists this afternoon. And I would like to first of all use this opportunity to thank them for availing themselves for what I believe is going to be a thought-provoking discussion. Now, the first panelist that I want to introduce, I'm going to introduce all of them now, and that will make it easier when we get to the presentation so that we can go from one presentation to the other. But I would like to start off with Judge Dennis Davies. He's a former judge of the High Court. He's also quite involved as chair of the Davis Tax Commission, being the drafter of the Competition Act in 1998. And the Companies Act of 2008, very well known. He's been an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town, the Western Cape, Wits, and he's an extraordinary professor here at the University of the Free State, specifically in our Center for Human Rights. He's authored various books and have held different professorial posts at the Universities of Toronto, Melbourne, Harvard, Florida Brown, Georgetown, and New York University. So, Judge Dennis Davies, welcome to our panel, and we're obviously also looking forward when we get to your slot. We also have in our midst Advocate Paul Hoffman, Senior Counsel, and he's been practicing law at the side bar from 1975 to 1980. And at the Cape Town Bar from 1980 to 2006. I think Paul is probably best known for his work on the irregularities on the arms deal and also the unconstitutionality of the Hawks and the bread cartel case in which a general class action was developed by the courts. He's also the author of many articles and books. In one book, focusing on confronting the corrupt, which was published by Tafelberg publisher. Paul, also welcome, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Then we also honored in our presence by the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions, Advocate Omar Rabachi, and I don't know whether we can just see whether she could put on a video. Welcome, Advocate Rabachi. She, as he indicated, she serves as Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions and is responsible for the asset forfeiture unit within the National Prosecuting Authority. She was previously Director of the Asset Forfeiture Unit during its formative years, after which she joined the corporate sector in the area of governance and risk, followed by the bar and practicing as an advocate before rejoining the AFU in 2020. Advocate, we're also honored to have you here. I know that you're going to be partnering up with another colleague of yours, Advocate Cronje, which is the head of the Investigative Directorate. And we're also looking forward to see her joining as part of a dual presentation when we get to your slot. Finally on the panel, but not the least, we have Professor John Mukambisi, who is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Law here at the University of the Free State. John has been a full professor for more than 16 years. From 2005 to 2007, he served as Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Law at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And then after that, he served as Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of the College of Law and Management Studies at UKZN for 10 years. He published widely, over 70 publications, and he was also chairperson of the Higher Education Quality Committee of South Africa and a member of the Council on Higher Education. So John, also welcome to be, and welcome, and I'm glad that you're also part of this panel. So colleagues, we're gonna start. We've given each of the panelists about 10 minutes, and I'm gonna be relatively strict on the time, because I know that there is going to be lots of questions, and I would like you to participate. Use the chat box if there are specific questions that you would like to jot down. I will also ask questions, pick some of the questions, and obviously we will not be able to get to all of the questions, but we've asked the panelists if there's an opportunity for them to respond to some of those questions in the chat box, that they do so they will also respond directly to those questions. But ultimately, I think it's we're here to listen what our panelists have to say. And our first presenter, and I'm going to ask our other panelists and myself, we will switch off our cameras, and our first presenter is Judge Dennis Davies. Dennis, over to you, and you've got 10 minutes to take us through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a privilege to share this platform with such distinguished colleagues. I'm going to make 3 sets of points. Let's just talk briefly about corruption. I want to talk a little about courts, and I want to talk about some remedies. In relation to corruption, there's so many things one can say, but the truth about it was that in 1994, when we finally launched our constitutional enterprise into a democratic South Africa, the real essence of our project was to convert a culture of authoritarianism into a culture of justification, to quote the great and late Etienne Muranic. And fundamental to that were 2 principles, really: transparency and accountability, amongst many others, but transparency and accountability with regard to governance. And sadly, to a large degree, those principles have been honored more in the breach than in the compliance. And the question is, why? What has happened over the last 25 years so that, in fact, instead of staunching the kind of corruption that was endemic during the apartheid era, and let's be blunt about that, why is it that this has increased exponentially rather than, in a sense, being converted into the kind of democratic regime that we wanted to? And there are many reasons for this, most of which I can't go into given the limitations of time. But let me offer a few. It does seem to me that in the context of a society which has been so bad in relation to inclusive growth, and in a society where to a large degree the historically disadvantaged remain the presently disadvantaged, there is a tremendous temptation to use political office of any kind to, as it were, acquire wealth, to acquire income of a kind that otherwise wouldn't be available to one. So that in a sense, instead of building a kind of inclusive economy where all would be able to participate, there has been a tendency to say, well, if I can get political office, this is the route to riches of all kind. And of course, the private sector has then not been adverse, as we've seen with all sorts of revelations such as Bosasa et al. To join the party in this regard. And so to a considerable extent, we have essentially substituted a accountability culture, to the extent promised in the Constitution, to a rent-seeking one. And we now have rent seekers both in the public sector and in the private sector. And it has become so endemic to the nature of South African society that scarcely a day goes by without us reading about the way in which rent seeking of this particular kind has become the order of the day. Now, I think we could extend that particular argument in a whole manner of means, but I just wanted to pigeonhole it, given the time available to me. I think there's another controversial question that we need to ask ourselves, which is, why is it that there's no real moral authority in the country? Why is it that to a large degree, this kind of nefarious activity takes place almost with impunity? There's no doubt about it that we need to look to our political structures in this regard. We heard the president the other day on the Zondo Commission. I will leave to the audience the evaluation of that particular performance. But there is no question about it that the political framework in which we now operate makes it so much more difficult to kind of have political accountability and therefore transparency and accountability in general. And one of the points that was being made over and over again by Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, which is really important in his exchange with the president, was the failure of the parliamentary structure to render the executive and the various forms of bureaucracy accountable. And we've seen lamentable failures in this particular regard, both from Parliament and in the way in which, to be perfectly honest, cadre deployment has created havoc in all manner of organizations, as in fact the Deputy Chief Justice pointed out in his questioning of the President of the country. There is also the other point, which is that in a society as racist as ours still remains, it becomes, and I raise this point because it's a controversial point, but I want to raise it because I think it's important that we discuss it, that we were supposed to be a society which in a sense would recreate a South African identity in which all would be able to participate equally fairly and with impunity in our society. And racism and sexism continue, and homophobia continue to haunt our society in all manner of ways. But sometimes, if you can appropriate the race discourse and you can criticize your critics who point to the corruption to which you've been participant, or alternatively the utter delinquent behavior to which you've exhibited clearly consistent practice, provided you can reappropriate the race card, you seem to be able to justify the conduct that you should be held accountable for. And that does not mean that there aren't many racists out there who essentially take joy when any Black person is held up to account. But what I'm saying is something broader, that there has to be a way in which we can develop a normative framework so that we can evaluate both public and private performance in such a manner that, in fact, it doesn't lend itself susceptible to opportunistic uses of racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever the case may be, and that the genuine endemic practices which haunt our country continue to be held to account, whilst at the same time we hold the corruptors, no matter where they come from. And I want to say that it is quite clear that the one thing we have in South Africa is non-racial corruption, which is a dreadful indictment of our society as a whole. But I do think we need to essentially talk about the moral authority of our country in that regard. Secondly, I think it's true that to a large degree we've had a great deal of difficulty in being able to hold people to account because of the way in which the so-called Stalingrad strategy has been employed. That is the strategy which to a large degree allows for appeal after appeal after appeal. To some extent, the efforts of people to ensure that the state doesn't pay for many of these particular trials and interlocutory applications is a move in the right direction. But I do think that to a large extent, the courts are going to have to think very deeply and carefully about giving leave to appeal in these particular cases on all sorts of spurious grounds, rather than bringing cases to finality, which has been a very significant problem. And we can talk about that too. This again, as I say, I'm conscious of time. The third point, which I do want to spend my last 2 minutes on, 2.5 minutes on, is the question of remedies. Now, the Zondo Commission obviously is going to eventually, and I think it's going to be somewhat later than sooner, produce a voluminous report in this particular regard. But that's all it'll be, is a voluminous report. It won't do more than that. It will effectively hold all sorts of people to account, but of course, they'll have to be charged. they'll have to be held accountable under the criminal justice system or some other measure. And that means far more than just a commission of inquiry, which all too often essentially is a decommissioning rather than a commissioning of issues. And that then raises, well, who's there going to do it? And my own view, for what it's worth, is that I think that whilst the NPA, and we've got a representative here, or representatives, are indeed at least turning their ship around, and that's very commendable that they should be doing it. In many cases, many of these intricate cases of financial fraud and corruption are very difficult, and you do need a range of extraordinary expertise to bring these cases to successful fruition. Now, I'm not in favor of a new institution. I think we've got enough institutions as we speak. What I think we should be doing is obviously hoping to strengthen the NPA, which should also reach out to the expertise in the country that can assist in this regard in a fulsome way. But for my part, and here's my concluding, I still believe that the best way of dealing with corruption of the kind that we have seen right across the board, and we can extend that from the Steinhoff case to the cases of state capture under the Zondo umbrella, if I could put it that way, the best way to deal with that is the Al Capone strategy, which is tax evasion and the use of the South African Revenue Service to hold people to account. One of the reasons that I've joined the Revenue Service as a consultant, because I truly believe that if we can expedite these cases and we can actually find people guilty of tax fraud, we hold them to account. Some of them might go to jail, but certainly they'll have to pay back significant sums of money which they've stolen from the fiscus, whether it be in the private sector or in the public sector. So for me, the way in which Mr. Kieswetter has begun to totally transform SARS back into the pristine unit that it was under Praveen Gordhan is the best possible basis by which we are going to expunge the scourge of corruption in this country and up the ante for those who seek to actually deal with the problem.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I think that gives us a very good, fantastic start to this panel discussion. But thank you very much, and also welcome to colleagues and guests and staff members, alumni from the Netherlands, Namibia, and other parts of the world, even from Cape Town. So welcome, Advocate Paul Hoffman. Over to you.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for the opportunity to work in the stratosphere with such clever people. I don't, as a mere NGO worker, I don't often get such an opportunity. Like the judge, I'm also going to divide my presentation into three areas. The first one, I will try in my own way to answer the question, why is there currently a culture of corruption with impunity in South Africa? Then, as you indicated in the intro, I will talk about the Glenister case and its significance today. And finally, I will tackle the point about what is the best practice way forward from where we are here. Now, if we ask ordinary people in the street what is worrying them, they will tell you that they are worried about unemployment, they are worried about patchy service delivery, and they are worried about the levels of inequality in the country. And all of those can be attributed to the fact that the levels of corruption with impunity in South Africa have become so high that it is almost impossible to attract new investment that creates jobs and addresses the other ailments of society. The impunity started when the anti-corruption machinery of state that was in place in 2007 at the election of Jacob Zuma at the Polokwane conference of the ANC was dissolved. The Scorpions were a well-functioning institution that was simply closed down. And when Helen Zille tried to find out from the then Secretary General of the ANC, Gwedi Mantashe, he simply said the Scorpions are taking too much interest in important members of the ANC, and we are closing them down. We are putting the investigators into the police, and we are putting the prosecutors back into the NPA. And of course, the process was fairly easy because the Scorpions were a statutory body and they could be closed down by a simple majority in Parliament. The ANC had a simple majority. The efforts to head them off at the pass failed, and despite a lot of civil society and opposition within Parliament, the Scorpions were disbanded and they remained disbanded. So the culture of impunity has grown because you can practice corruption without getting into trouble in South Africa. The National Prosecuting Authority has been hollowed out. That's its term, not mine. It has an infestation of saboteurs who were put there during the Zuma years to make sure that nobody in the state capture project ever sees the orange overalls that are required. And we stagger on from crisis to crisis and discover, as the Zondo evidence unfolds, that somewhere between R1 trillion and R1.5 trillion has gone into the hands of the looters and away from the deserving poor, 60% of the population who could enjoy services. Remember, R1 trillion has 18 zeros to the left of the decimal point. The second aspect that I want to talk about, and I can talk perhaps with more authority than most on this, having been in court on all three occasions that Mr. Glenister visited the Constitutional Court. He was a public-spirited litigant who took on the development of the Hawks, and to everybody's surprise, in 2011, he succeeded in persuading the narrowest possible majority of the judges in the Constitutional Court that the creation of the Hawks was not in compliance with the Constitution. The judges had regard to the international obligations of South Africa to keep adequate anti-corruption machinery of state, and they particularly had regard to the fact that the incidence of corruption is a human rights issue in a country in which the state is obliged to respect and protect, promote and fulfill all of the human rights that are guaranteed to all in the Bill of Rights. And in giving their judgment, they developed in the second Glenister case in 2011 the 5 criteria that they prescribed for the anti-corruption machinery of state. They weren't prepared to say exactly what should be done. They simply asked Parliament to make the reasonable decision of a reasonable decision maker in the circumstances with having regard to 5 criteria, which we now call the STIRS criteria. The first S in STIRS stands for specialized. Obviously, if you are going to be on top of the greedy, corrupt people, you have to be smarter than them, and being specialized is the way to do it. The other aspect of specialization is that those involved in the job only work on corruption and nothing else. That has not happened since the Scorpions were disbanded. The second criterion is the training that is required. The Scorpions were sent to the FBI and to Scotland Yard for training. The Hawks haven't had that privilege. The third is independence, which means the ability to act without fear, favor, or prejudice. The fourth, the R in STIRS, is the resourcing in guaranteed fashion of the anti-corruption machinery of state, and the fifth of the criteria that was set up in Glenister 2 is the one that the Scorpions did not have. They were not able to enjoy security of tenure of office, which is one of the internationally recognized criteria for proper anti-corruption machinery of state. And because they were not secure, they had the problem that they could be closed down by a simple majority, and they were closed down by a simple majority. So that particular solution that the Scorpions were succeeding at did not work. So then, what are we to do in the circumstances in which we find ourselves now? What is the solution to the problem? Well, the NEC of the ANC, which is its highest decision-making body between conferences, has applied its mind to the problem, and it, in August last year, passed an urgent resolution calling upon Cabinet to create and establish a new unit which has to be specialized. It must be permanent in nature and multidisciplinary in its scope. It must be a standalone single entity, and it must be independent, established urgently to deal with the corrupt. Now, those criteria overlap, as you will have seen, quite extensively with the criteria that were laid down in binding fashion in Glenister 2 and were confirmed in Glenister 3, even though the court was not prepared to countenance the attack on keeping the hawks in the police rather than moving them into an independent agency, which the NEC is now asking for. The president himself, in his SONA address in February this year, has said that the idea in cabinet is to create a statutory body which answers to Parliament. So he too wants a new body, in spite of what Judge Davis has told this seminar. A new body seems to be popular both with the NEC and with the cabinet. Now, his new body is going to be of a statutory nature, reporting to Parliament and not to the executive. The second point is a good one. The idea of creating a statutory body is simply to replicate what happened with the Scorpions. And if a bad president were to succeed President Ramaphosa, and we can think of candidates who are in the inside lane on that, then it would be open to that person to do exactly what Jacob Zuma did in 2007 and have the new statutory body closed down by a simple majority in Parliament. So the solution that Accountability Now has been punting since 2012, when we presented draft legislation, which I'm afraid is out of date because we worked on the basis that the NPA was intact, and we know that the NPA is not intact, that it admits that it's not intact, and that it is going to take several years to weed out the saboteurs that are there making dockets disappear and undermining efforts to hold those responsible for grand corruption to account. So if we were to create a Chapter 9 institution that answers to Parliament and is STIRS compliant, I think that is the best practice way forward. And I must say the Al Capone option is an attractive one. I'm sure we will have a chat about it at question time. But the problem about the Al Capone option is that it does not address the recovery of the loot of state capture, which would be one of the main jobs of the new Chapter 9 institution that we propose, the Integrity Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I think you mentioned about the NPA not intact. Our next presenter actually is from the NPA, the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions. And as I have indicated in my opening remarks, this is going to be a dual presentation. She will also be joined by Advocate Cronje. Just to make sure that we balance the time, I've given for both of them about 12 minutes or so, just to give to bring their message across. But in the meantime, please make use of the Q&A and the chat box to ask some questions, because after Advocate Omar Abaji, we will Advocate Cronje, we will have our last speaker, and then after the last speaker, we will go into discussion. So please let those questions come through in the meantime. But over to you, Advocate Omar Abaji.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. And equally, I just want to echo the sentiments of the other speakers in appreciating this opportunity to participate in this important topic of corruption that's really a pandemic in our country. So I am representing the National Prosecuting Authority here. And if we go to the second slide, you will see that our mandate comes from the Constitution. We are here to institute criminal proceedings as well as recover process of crime, which it's not, which is almost making sure that there is no incentive to commit crime. So we can do it through a coordinated specialized services or general services. Next slide. And then the mandate of the NPA was increased, right? As I've said, we are here to institute criminal proceedings. We are here to prosecute in terms of the Constitution. But 2 years ago, the president then came with a proclamation and created an investigative directorate, which also then investigates. So we get cases from SAPS, the Hawks, which is DPCI, and SIU. So now we're in a position to do more since 2 years ago. Next slide. We think that we are aligned to, in slide 4, to what government is also trying to do in terms of making sure that the scourge of crime, in particular corruption, is fought. So we are aligned with the fact that government has now come up with what we call NACS, National Anti-Corruption Strategy. There's also an interministerial committee which is going to look into fighting of crime. And therefore it's quite important that as part of law enforcement, NPA is aligned with government is doing. Next slide. I've already spoken to this. I just want to mention here that in 2003, government, in fact, cabinet decided there should be what is called on the far right, ACTT, Anti-Corruption Task Team, which is the law enforcement agencies coming together to fight corruption. As Advocate Paul Hoffman has indicated, our position in NPA is that we do know what has happened. Our institutions were hollowed out, but it was not only NPA, it was also other law enforcement agencies. Next slide. Now, the second issue that I needed to speak to a couple of issues, but the first one was, what is NPA? What are you doing about this? I've explained that. The second issue was, what are your challenges in terms of fighting crime? We've got capacity and capability issues. Now, just in terms of capacity, in creating the investigative directorate 2 years ago, it was done through secondment, which is not ideal. Most of them came into the ID carrying the dockets from GPCI and SAPS. So that's not how you capacitate an institution that has to fight a pandemic as big as corruption. So just in summary, capability and capacity, it's our main issues. So what are the solutions that we have that have been put in place? As I've said, slide 6, government in 2003 created what is called ACTT, Anti-Corruption Task Team, and asked all law enforcement agencies to work together in a coordinated manner, because we hand over from each other. The investigative agencies like SAPS and DPCI and SIU investigate, and then they refer to NPA that's been created by the Constitution to prosecute. ACTT was one of those institutions that was hollowed out, but the good news is that we are in the process of rebuilding the ACTT. We've got all sorts of administrative issues that we had to sort out, prioritizing cases, case selection criteria, all the principal meet monthly to track how we are doing in terms of enrolling cases for prosecution, because that's key. That's the part we can play, deterrent, prosecuting crime. And I must say, the good news is that this is working so well. I'm sitting in here with colleagues that are full-time at the ACTT at a very senior level, Special Director Lebo Baloyi, Priya Baseswa, and Advocate Yanis Kete. So if there are any questions in terms of how we've reorganized ourselves as law enforcement, plus government departments like Treasury, you're welcome to ask on this issue. Next slide, 7. Now, over and above reorganizing ourselves as law enforcement agencies, we have got a model called Fusion Center. Again, it's about being co-located in one place, and currently we're working from the Financial Intelligence Center in Centurion to make sure that we fast track fighting of corruption. This model was started when we started to have COVID corruption. Next slide. Slide 8, in 2019, the Hawks and NPA came together and prioritized cases. And this shows progress in terms of the number of cases that were prioritized. They came up with a list of 90 in September 2019. And where we are showing progress. We're not where we want to be, but this is good progress in the sense that over 40 cases have been enrolled from the 90. Move on to the next slide, slide 9. The investigative directorate, since it started, it really has done a lot of sterling work, and the challenges that they've faced in terms of setting up. They've done a lot of cases in the security sector, 78 dockets. They've got state-owned enterprises and high-level corruption, and all of these cases are the cases that have already been enrolled. And in the public space, the last big one they've done with the Corporation of Crown Prosecution last week, and they're really gaining traction in terms of fighting corruption. Moving along to the next slide. There's a lot of mitigating actions that are in place. As I've told you, we are rebuilding the ACTT. The ID is really a game changer in NPA and in terms of fighting corruption. But over and above that, we are collaborating with other law enforcement agencies beyond being in the ACTT and using the Fusion Center model. We are collaborating, and I'm the one who's heading this collaboration. Hence, I was the chosen person to come in and talk to the issue of corruption and in terms of what we're doing. NPA cannot succeed on its own. And we always say that if you capacitate NPA, you need to equally capacitate the Hawks. So we have got bi-weekly meetings in terms whereof we look at the priority of cases that we want to be enrolled. Some will say within the next 6 months, let's look at what we can do to show that we can make impact. And those cases must have potential that we bring back the stolen money. You've heard Advocate Polman talk about how much has been lost through graft. So we make sure that this specialized project in terms of making sure that we bring back the stolen money, in terms of sitting together and prioritizing. And in this regard, I sit with at the highest level, the members of the DPCI, the brigadier in charge of specialized corruption. I sit with the general in charge of commercial crime to make sure that we track progress. Moving along, and I just want to start by to wrap up. Slide 11. We really have got further plans that we're putting in place in terms of, in March 2021, we've now agreed that NPA and DPCI need to co-locate. So the special investigating unit in DPCI, which is tracing assets, is going to co-locate with asset forfeiture unit so that we can fast track recovery of the process of crime. We've gotten out of the tracks as far as appointing special investigators, and I won't deal with that. I will leave it to Advocate Cronje to deal with that. We are also capacitating NPA, particularly the specialized units, SCCU, Specialized Commercial Crime Unit, the AFU, to make sure that we get all the right skills that we need to be fit for purpose. So what is the remedy? What have I demonstrated? I've demonstrated that we are reorganizing ourselves, we are rebuilding to make sure that we are going to be on top of crime and fighting corruption in particular. I think it's critical, it's important that we strengthen law enforcement agencies. We report to Parliament in particular as law enforcement agencies. We don't report as NPA, just to make sure that the collaboration is working. So in terms of a remedy, I feel strongly that we are on the right track. We just need to rebuild and make sure that there's impetus in capacitating law enforcement agencies. And I hand over to my colleague, Advocate Hemion Cronje.
Thank you very much, Advocate Rabachi. We welcome Advocate Cronje. And Advocate, if we can give you about 5 minutes or so just to give your part of the presentation, but welcome. I was glad to have you part of this panel as well. Over to you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this this debate. I think it's a debate that we need to have, and we need to get better at working together to implement some of the solutions we come up with. So thank you to Advocate Rabachi, who is taking the lead on coordinating our corruption efforts. And as she has said, you know, that has been recognized as the biggest challenge in the system, is the lack of proper coordination. But I want to take my cue from former Judge Dennis Davis, to say that, to answer the question, is corruption endemic, and what are we going to do about the perception that the culture of impunity is out of control? What are we doing in the NPA to address the sense that you can engage in corrupt activities and the system is just too dysfunctional to ever bring you to book? Advocate Hoffman, in every forum I've seen him and every newspaper article that he's ever published in, has set out these 5 criteria that he believes our efforts to combat corruption in South Africa should conform to. And I certainly agree. I agree that specialization is critical. I agree that resources is critical. I agree that training is critical, and similarly, independence is important. But achieving these things in practice, I am with Dennis Davis when I say that I don't believe creating a new agency, which is what we want to do when we have difficult challenges, is the answer. There is no reason why we can't have specialization in the current context. we don't have specialization, and that's what we need to fix. We need to fix, but we need to understand what sort of specialization do we need to properly address the kind of corruption that is starting to look like it's endemic in South Africa. The specialization we need is specialization in digital forensics. You know, whether you create that specialist capability in one agency or another, it needs to be created and it needs to be effective. We have the advantage that in the Zondo Commission, we have created a digital forensic capability that I believe is almost second to none. And so what needs to happen is that capability now needs to be put at the disposal of law enforcement and needs to be made to work for us. So that process has begun, and the commission is in the last month or two of wrapping up its work. When that capability becomes available to law enforcement, we have the beginning of the kind of specialization, the kind of specialist equipment that we need. We then need to make sure that we have the kind of specialist skills to utilize the equipment effectively to support investigations. The kind of training we need. Training needs to happen across the system. I certainly want to acknowledge the impact of state capture on our institutions. It's been devastating. So, you know, we need training not just in the specialist areas, but we need training in the basics. There have not been very many major corruption prosecutions in South Africa for many years now. So there isn't a cadre of skilled corruption prosecutors, big case corruption prosecutors, from which to constitute a new agency. So you can wave your magic wand and your corruption Chapter 9 institution can come into existence, but you're still going to have to find the specialist skilled, trained people, experienced people to populate that institution. There are no quick fixes. There are no easy way out. The training, the aspirant prosecutor program of the NPA has now come back into existence, and we are reinforcing and strengthening that training, and taking, learning from our colleagues around the world who do have the experience and do have the expertise of dealing with major corruption cases, and learning lessons from them is what we're doing and have to keep doing. So, it's a slow process and it's a very frustrating process. The system has been very broken. And I think the steps we are taking to build and to rebuild are bearing fruit, not in the spectacular way that we had all had hoped, that it would, happen when you have a change of government, I suppose, or a change of leadership. You expect that automatically things will be done completely differently. That certainly I suffered from a bit of that naivety, but I think that, the building blocks are there and we should start to see the results, and we certainly shouldn't be complacent, but let's discuss the real issues. Let's discuss how do we resource, how do we make trials happen more speedily? Why not have a corruption court? That's how you get specialization, not just of prosecutors, but also of judges, and you build confidence with judges who aren't going to fall for the game playing, the Stalingrad tactics. So, the toolkit needs to have a lot of remedies in it, and we are slowly building these remedies. And so I think it would be great if we could do more of this and move much more speedily, but it's very easy to destroy a system. It's a lot harder to put in place the building blocks. But let's have the discussion. Let's hear what the questions are about how do we go about fixing the problem we clearly have, which is a culture of impunity and rampant corruption. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Advocate Cronje. And I think the question about the whole idea of specialization, the whole idea of not creating a new statutory body is coming out quite clear. But in the next presentation by the Dean of Law here at the University of the Free State, Professor John Mukambisi, he's probably arguing exactly that there need to be much more coordination in the system, that you don't need new structures. But John, I'm not going to do your presentation on your behalf. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Peterson, and specifically thank you for including me on this panel discussing such an important issue. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists and all those who have tuned in for this discussion. Thank you for joining us. The argument I'm going to present is this.
John, I just want to check, are you going to share a presentation or are you just going to talk? Yeah, okay, because I would have liked for your, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. So sorry about that. So I was saying, Chair, that the argument I'm going to present is this, that there are enough laws to deal with corruption in South Africa, but the problem persists and has instead become endemic. And why is this so? And what can be done? Now, obviously, some of the things I'm going to say here have already been said by my fellow panelists. That's always the danger of speaking last. But that shouldn't be a problem. I think repetition is always good for emphasis. So whenever I talk or write about corruption, I always remind my audience or readers that corruption is not new. It is probably as old as mankind. I also remind my audience that corruption is not unique to South Africa. It happens in many other parts of the world. And I also emphasize that corruption is not confined to the public sector, as you mentioned, Chair. It also happens in the private sector. Then I make my audience or readers aware that actually, South Africa has an adequate and sufficient legal framework to deal with corruption. I draw their attention to the international anti-corruption treaties and agreements that South Africa is party to, the various provisions in the South African Constitution that have direct or indirect bearing on corruption, although the word corruption is actually not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. And I also draw their attention to several statutes that deal with corruption directly or indirectly, including the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act of 2004. So my audience, including yourselves, would certainly always have a right to ask, so what's the problem? Why is corruption an endemic pandemic in South Africa? And I think it was Judge Davis who mentioned that there are numerous reasons for this. I think we would probably spend the whole day here if we're going to talk about all the reasons why corruption is endemic. So I choose to focus on 4 or 5 of these. And the first one for me is that corruption in South Africa has become institutionalized, systemic, and normalized. And when something becomes institutionalized, systemic, and normalized, then it becomes endemic. Secondly, I think our political leadership is largely responsible. Well, you need to go no further than the State Capture Commission to see how the political leadership of this country are responsible for the endemic corruption. Well, many of you will probably remember a former national spokesman of the ANC who once publicly stated that I did not struggle to be poor. So many of our current leaders are living testimony of that statement. The other reason for me, and this is very important, and I think some of the panelists have already referred to this, is lack of political accountability. The degree of accountability in a political system is largely dependent, is largely determined by the specific features of that political system. And one of the main features of the South African political system is its electoral system. And as we all know, our electoral system is based on party list proportional representation, which means that parties are represented in parliament in proportion to their electoral support. What this means in turn is that you vote for a party and the party decides who will represent you in parliament. The obvious result is that our politicians are accountable to no one but themselves. Fourthly, I think the law does not bite hard enough. It's one thing to have the laws, as I mentioned, but it is also a completely different thing to have them properly and effectively enforced. And this brings into question the role of law enforcement agencies. And as my colleagues have already indicated, there are a number of these agencies in South Africa that claim to be fighting corruption, or rather part of whose mandate is to fight corruption. So we have the South African Police Services, we have the Hawks, we have the Special Investigative Unit, we have the National Prosecuting Authority, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, most South Africans do not trust that these agencies are able to bring corrupt officials to book. Why? Because they are part of the problem. Not only are some of the members of these agencies perceived to be corrupt themselves, but the agencies themselves are perceived to be compromised, captured, and truthless. And fifthly, I think we are also our own worst enemy. Yes, we the people. You need to be in Bloemfontein when a high-ranking ANC official is appearing in court on charges of corruption. The streets are flooded with protesting masses, not against, but in support of the accused official. Why? Because ours is a society with large numbers of poor, desperate, and vulnerable people who are ready to accept simple black and white explanations of the causes of their problems. They then become easily manipulated to believe that corruption is a legitimate means of income redistribution and that corrupt leaders are genuine role models whose only sin is taking a stand against so-called white monopoly capital. So those are some of the reasons I thought I would highlight. But then, of course, I want to spend the last 4 minutes on what should be done. And of course, these are just my own suggestions. And of course, there are many things that could be done, but I will again focus on just a few. Because many people have come up with various recommendations on how to end or curb corruption in South Africa. The truth of the matter, however, is that there is no silver bullet. Looking at the problems I have just stated, the following suggestions for me would make a good starting point. First of all, we need to end the impunity by making law enforcement more effective and more efficient. So what this requires, firstly, is the removal of all the rotten apples from the law enforcement bag. There's nothing as self-defeating as having corrupt law enforcement officers trying to enforce the law. This is one situation where the slogan, "It takes a thief to catch a thief," does not actually work. Secondly, citizens should be empowered to hold political leaders accountable. Frankly, the only way to do this is to overhaul the electoral system so that political leaders are directly accountable to specific voter constituencies. You mess up, they vote you out. And thirdly, and this is important, the role of the ruling party. Very often we talk about corruption in South Africa. When we do that, of course, many fingers point at the ruling party, both for what it has done and what it has failed to do. In his testimony before the State Capture Commission last week, the president of the African National Congress admitted that certain things have gone horribly wrong. Those were his words, they were not my words. Some things have gone horribly wrong. So what the ANC needs to do, and of course other political parties, is to appoint more competent, more honest, and more decent leadership at all levels. But the ANC must also lead by example and punish the bad behavior of its leaders and members. Senior party leaders, ministers, and public servants who are corrupt, even if they are powerful in the party, must be fired and not just begged to step down. And if they refuse to step down, they are begged again. They are cajoled into stepping down. If they refuse, the deadlines are extended. This is not good for the government trying to restore the moral authority to deal credibly with corruption and maladministration. And finally, Chair, we need an independent, dedicated, permanent anti-corruption commission or agency. as Advocate Hoffman indicated earlier on, this was called for by the Constitutional Court in the Glenister cases. And Advocate Hoffman dealt with this quite sufficiently. I know Judge Davis is not in support of a new agency, but it really depends on what type of agency we are talking about. There are many countries with such agencies or commissions. And I always, in my writings, I always use the Hong Kong model, where their anti-corruption commission has been extremely successful in reducing and curbing corruption. But then we go on dilly-dallying, and of course there are no prizes for guessing that the reason why we dilly-dally over this matter is the very same reason why the scorpions were abolished, as explained earlier by Advocate Hoffman. So in conclusion, Chair, I think it is fair to say that fighting corruption is everyone's responsibility. It is a collective responsibility in which citizens have to work in partnership with government to eradicate this corruption pandemic. At the very least, the people must rise and say enough is enough. You will probably remember the words of Edmund Burke, who captured this very properly when he said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." And obviously there are those who always say that a country is as corrupt as its citizens allow it to be. So we all have a role to play. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, John. And yeah, it's in fact fantastic input. So I'm going to ask the panelists just to switch on their videos so that that people could see them, and then to see whether we can sort of create a little bit of interaction. It's always challenging to do that in a virtual environment. But I've seen questions coming in, and I'm going to direct a question specifically first to Judge Davis. And the question, and in fact, there's a couple of questions that talk to that, is that specifically in the state, that a lot of this corruption is to do with also cadre deployment. And one of the questions was saying, or first of all, to get your comments on that, and then secondly, there is a view that there was a High Court decision that is illegal to do that, and maybe Advocate Hoffman could come in at some point if you don't respond to that question directly, Dennis. But yeah, your comments on the cadre deployment and it, in fact, fueling the whole issue of corruption. You muted, Dennis.
The new famous phrase these days, isn't it? You muted. There's no question about it that the idea of cadre deployment, rather than in fact finding the best person for the job, has been disastrous in all sorts of areas. And I didn't take the president to entirely disagree with that proposition when it was put to him during his examination before the Zondo Commission. It obviously must be, because on a whole range of levels, it would be contrary in certain instances to legislation and the Constitution, as it were. Why, on what basis to employ somebody simply because they're a member of the party? And why that's become more obscene is because, I could understand in 1994, when you looked at the people who went into Parliament on behalf of the ANC, it encompassed an incredible amount of talent at that time. Given the apartheid structures, two things happened. Incredible talent went into Parliament on behalf of the ANC, and many of these people were perhaps the best that there were. The truth about it is that we are now very, we're 26 or 27 years away, but beyond that. And if we worried about the question of demography, that is that we want to have people in various office bearers who reflect the demography of the country, and I might say, quite rightly so too, there is more than enough talent in this country to draw upon of people who have absolutely nothing to do with ANC office bearers. And unless one actually starts doing that, which is finding people who are appropriate for the various positions, I'm afraid to say that we will continue to reproduce the levels of inefficiency and corruption that we've done, not because everybody who's an office bearer of the ANC is corrupt, but it plays in, that's the point I was trying to make, it plays in to a framework in which if you want to become wealthy, if you want to become rich, then in fact, you join the party and you can get yourself a position accordingly. And it's interesting that about 2 years ago, Thabo Mbeki in a Mandela speech made precisely that point. Said there's now a culture that all you've got to do is rich at all costs. And the idea that you put the country above the party and the country above your own personal interests, that's no longer the case. So frankly, we've got to get rid of that. You know, there are enough people in this country to be able to run these institutions if we look carefully for them, of great ability and great integrity, and we should be using every single one of them. You know, we shouldn't be wasting the talent in this country. So I'm afraid to say, I think cadre deployment is something which hopefully we can get rid of and ensure that our institutions are staffed by the right people right across the, and what I mean by right people is people who are chosen because they can run the damn thing, not because of the fact of their loyalty to any particular political party, whether it be the ANC in the rest of the country or the DA in the Western Cape, as the case may be.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Paul, you want to comment on this point? Because I've got another point that I want to raise with the national director of with the NPA, but you can come in.
Yes, I must say I agree with Dennis in relation to the evils of cadre deployment. If you think about it logically, we're a country of nearly 60 million people, and we want, in terms of ANC policy, for our entire public administration, all of our employees and boards in state-owned enterprises to be drawn from the 1 million people who happen to be members of the ANC. Well, that isn't what Section 195 of the Constitution is about. It is about ethical and good human resource management practices to cultivate career development, not to make opportunities for looting or to get into public service for any other reason than to serve the public. Too many people in South Africa are in public service to enrich themselves, and they've quite forgotten that they are meant to be there to serve the people. The case that is asked about in the chat room is a very interesting one called Mlokoti versus the Amatola District Municipality. There were two candidates for the municipal manager position. The political structures in the municipality decided that the best candidate should go forward and become the municipal manager. The local, the regional ANC cadre deployment committee said, no, we want our man there. And that was taken to court, and their man was summarily removed from office by Judge Pickering to put the correct person in place of the cadre who had been deployed so irregularly. One of the main recommendations of the Zondo Commission should be that cadre deployment in the public administration and state-owned enterprises must end immediately.
Right, thank you very much, Advocate Hoffman. I want to go to Advocate Rabachi and Advocate Cronje, where the whole issue of rebuilding the NPA, much better coordination in that system came out through both of your presentations, but you were arguing, specifically Advocate Cronje was saying that this is a slow process, that you were also naive when you sort of started and thought that could happen very quickly. The question that I want to ask, coming out of the chats and the Q&A, is why don't we work together the system? Are some of those skills not available in the private sector? Maybe engagement with more proactive engagement with the universities to be able to see to what extent we could resource that far better. And why is it so difficult to get momentum in the coordination part? What are the issues that really blocks a faster progression on the coordination? So I don't know who wants to go first, but yeah, maybe. Sorry.
Am I
yes, you're audible. So you want to go first, Advocate Cronje?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I'm in the right group. I'll follow on Advocate Rabaji's lead.
Okay, 100%. Advocate Rabaji.
I think you're really asking a very good question in terms of saying, why don't we work together with the universities in trying to get better talent in and good talent in. So we smiled because between AFU and ID, we have agreed to start an aspirant investigator and young advocates program, bring in young, fresh, competent talent in NPA so that they grow in law enforcement. Law enforcement is not a natural space where, for instance, myself as an advocate will find me in. I came in here early 90s and I left to go to the bar and private sector. Because the career prospects and the pay is better. So there's a lot of things that we want to fix in tackling that, because for as long as we close out this young, bright, talent, competent, highly skilled, we'll never be able to have all the skills that we need to fight corruption. We definitely need cyber forensic skills, digital skills, and those we'll find in this young talent, and I think you're spot on in terms of we need to work with universities. And then the second question you've asked is there a challenge with coordination in the law enforcement space? Yes, there is a challenge. We're trying our best, but there is a challenge. First, most law enforcement agencies sitting as we are here, we are loaded. We don't have all the necessary manpower that we need to fight corruption and to fight crime. For instance, in the case of NPA, for the last 5 years before the new NDPP Advocate Batoy came in, there hasn't been any budget allocation. So going, for instance, to the ID, the creation of the ID, the case in point, when it was created, few DPCI members and detective service members were seconded, but they had to continue to carry their loads because they are also under capacitated. So that's a big problem. So hence we're thinking of creating an aspirant program, make sure that we have an agreement with the LPC, the Legal Practice Council, that they recognize that our aspirants must be admitted attorneys or admitted advocates or, forensic accountants once they've gone through very rigorous training. In fact, we are in discussion with some of the universities to start this aspirant program. So we think that's the route we should go. So under capacity in law enforcement disables coordination. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll hand over to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Advocate Rabaji. Advocate Cornelia.
I have very little to add to that. Safe to say that there is an issue with security of tenure, particularly of investigators assigned to the investigating directorate. We rely primarily on secondments at the moment, and that has been hugely challenging. But the ways in which we're trying to work with the private sector, my experience is that these are stopgap measures, short term, because at the moment, we outsource a lot of core investigation and prosecution functions, and it's not a sustainable model because you basically equip your opponents with an understanding of how you work and an understanding of your methodologies, and then they are available to accused persons to take you on. That's a simplistic way of looking for it and at it, but we need to grow our own timber, which is why we've decided to prioritize our new recruits, because there's another reason why young people and new recruits to the system, I firmly believe, is the answer, it's because the world is so very different. You know, we are prosecuting in a world where the volume of data that anyone will have to grapple with in mounting any prosecution is so vast that colleagues in the NPA who still insist on printing out their emails and you know, who feel only comfortable if they have dockets with all the paper in it, have to accept that they will be having rugby fields of dockets that they will take to court, and that just is not a sustainable model anymore. So our aspirant prosecutor program has to be rooted in the technology that is available today, and we have to adapt our court work to how we're going to lead these sorts of evidence. Those skills are nowhere in the system. And then the last thing I want to say is the prosecution has historically in this country been the stepchildren of the legal profession. And unless we change that around, unless we do what they do in the US, where law graduates from the top universities compete to get into the prosecution, not for the long term, but certainly to gain experience in the initial years. So unless we properly sell the prosecution as a place where you get excellent training, a place where you get excellent experience, and you can go out later on in your career to the private sector and work in corporations, work anywhere, because you've got this foundational training. That's how we're going to recruit people, not with salaries, and not with exclusively paying private sector salaries, because those are not sustainable.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I want before I want to bring Dennis and Paul in, there's a question I want to give to John. John, there's a question that say that how can citizens be empowered to assist the law enforcement in fighting corruption? You know, you were saying that corruption is everyone's task to deal with, and then with Dennis and Paul, are there examples that needs to happen specifically in relation to the Zondo Commission, where just to show that, you know, there are people that are found guilty, and there are examples that's been said. So are there enough material in the Zondo Commission that could be utilized to be used as examples? And then maybe Paul, your question is going to be about protection of witnesses. Are people scared to participate in that process because they're not fully protected? But let me start with John, and then I'll move to Dennis, and I'll move to Paul. John, if you could just sort of be brief in your response.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll be very brief. First of all, Chair, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation, the power of the citizens is in the vote. So citizens can change many things by the way they exercise their vote. But that does not exactly answer the question how they can help the law enforcement agencies. But again, as I mentioned in my presentation, citizens can work in partnership with government to eradicate this corruption pandemic. And as I said, they have the power to rise and say enough is enough. And there are many ways they can do this, not necessarily by taking on the streets, but also by, you know, providing information to these agencies, and also advocacy and other mechanisms. You cannot underestimate the power of civil society. Citizens can contribute through the civil society, because many citizens belong to some form of civil society or other. So I think that is the brief answer I could give to that, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Dennis, over to you. Any other comment you would like to make?
Yeah, very briefly. Firstly, I agree entirely with John. In fact, I agree with everything he said. So if I could just make that point, I totally agree with you, John. Let me say this, Francis. There will obviously be stuff that will come out of the Zondo Commission. I can't tell you the quality of the stuff. I can't tell you how detailed it will be. It does create some anxiety for me that it's going to be a monumental task with thousands, millions of pages to distill this into a usable report. And as somebody who's spent most of his life, at least in part, dealing with sophisticated financial structures and corporate structures. As a corporate lawyer, if I could put that hat on, this stuff's not easy. It's incredibly difficult, and there are not many people in the country. I mean, Hermione's right, of course, that you know, you can get people who train them and then they go back into the private sector. I'm not that worried about that, frankly. I'm trying to encourage SARS to do precisely that, which is to get people in for 3-4 years. Let's make a use of them for the 3-4 years. And like America, if they go out into the private sector, good luck afterwards, because we've got the benefit of that. We're going to get a revolving door policy. And I'm very encouraged to hear what both Advocate Rabi and Advocate Cornelius say about encouraging younger people. As somebody who's been teaching for most of my life, I think it's fantastic that you people are going to encourage young talent in, you know, and anything I can do to encourage that, please don't hesitate to ask. I really mean that. But let me make this point, and I'm going to end here because I know we haven't got time. I understand where growing timber, but we are in, there is a short-term absolute crisis, and let's not make any bones about it. If, for example, certain cases are brought, whether it be through the Zondo Commission, or if I might say, a high-profile case in your part of the world, which I won't say more about, which is about to happen, if those cases go pear-shaped, if those cases aren't prosecuted with the kind of absolute 150% capacity that they have to be, and that people walk off scot-free, either through the Zondo Commission or some of these other cases, we are in an utterly disastrous political situation. We should not underestimate the cost of that. The risks here are enormous. If you charge people with very serious crimes, you better get them convicted. If you don't, you can just imagine what the political throwback is going to be in a country as fraught as ours. So the stakes are huge. And my own view is that in the short term, we need every basic ability to make sure that these things happen. And where there are people within the private sector, and that's why, you know, people like myself, retired judges, more than happy to help. You know, we don't have any vested interest. We're not going back into the private sector. All of this should be used. It is a national crisis that we have to solve, because if we can actually ensure that certain of these particular people are sent to jail, all of these questions that we've had in the chat line now, Francis, they'll go away. Because once you've prosecuted and convicted 3 or 4 people, serious political pedigree, people are going to have an aha moment. And I can't emphasize that strongly enough.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis. Paul, do you want to come in from your perspective?
Yes, just on the Zondo Commission, I think we must all remember that the Zondo Commission has not got magical powers. The judge has to come to findings of fact on the basis of the evidence that is placed before him and interrogated before him. But those findings bind nobody. They are not the findings of a criminal court. The NPA has to start all over again as matters stand. If we do form a Chapter 9 anti-corruption body along the Hong Kong sort of model, then it would be the job of that dedicated, specialized, and properly trained institution to do it. The other aspect of the Zondo Commission is that it is likely to make recommendations that go to the structure and operations of the anti-corruption machinery of state. Once again, the recommendations bind nobody, and if the executive branch of government chooses not to accept, or if the NEC resolution of August last year falls by the wayside, in spite of it aligning with the idea of a Chapter 9 institution taking on the sort of work that the NEC is talking about, then we're going to find that the Zondo Commission has not served any good purpose other than to produce a great deal of material that could be of use to other institutions. You asked me about the lot of the whistleblower, and that is not a happy one in South Africa, as the law and the the situation on the ground pertains at present. We are working on the creation of a whistleblower protection fund, which we think can be funded through the insurance industry, through big business, and indeed through contributions from union members. That fund could be used to protect whistleblowers who lose their jobs, who have to see a psychiatrist and a psychologist, whose entire lifestyle is under threat, and who may be on the receiving end of the unkind ministrations of those who they have fingered. So a fund of that sort is useful. The whistleblower protection laws in South Africa can be the witness protection program itself, which is run by the NPA, can be tightened up somewhat so that potential witnesses are also included until such time as a decision is made as to whether they are going to be there. So in short, help from civil society with a properly administered fund, and help from the legislature with the tweaking of the laws that apply to whistleblowers to make them a little more whistleblower friendly than they are at the moment.
All right. So colleagues, I'll look at the time. It's 2 o'clock already, and I would have liked to have continue with this discussion. Obviously, this is a fantastic debate, and this is so topical currently. The things that I've extracted here is about the issues of coordination, about capacity building, and making sure that we build the capacity of specifically the NBA, but also the other organs of the state to look at it. The second one is the training, and I think that is something that we need to talk. And I totally agree with Dennis. There's lots of us that can, besides the universities, there's other people as well that could play a role, and that will also profile for me, because I was saying in my introductory remarks that the task of the university is actually to develop the leaders of tomorrow, to say, well, this is how society should look like. So the whole issue of ethics and all of those that comes with it is an opportunity for us to do that. But the third one that is very important, and I think, unfortunately, I'm not going to give an opportunity now for the NPA to respond, but that is to make sure that we prosecute and then we convict. And that part seems to be the most critical part, because if we get that wrong, the whole credibility of the system is under question. And there, for me, the role that not only the sort of the legal system in the context should play, but also the role that, as John has indicated, if the public exhibit in the way that they act, in terms of support of those individuals, say that we actually support the individual and not necessarily what the individual have done. That is also a message that goes out. So for me, that's important, where the citizens will have to come in and play a crucial role. I do think that we need to have a follow-up discussion on this at some point. I would like to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, Judge Dennis Davies, Advocate Paul Hoffman, Advocate Rabaji, Advocate Cronje, and Professor John Mukambisi. Thank you very much for this enlightening discussion, but it gives us a lot of food for thought, but it also gives us an opportunity to move forward. For all of those that have listened into this call or have been part of this call, I would like you to watch out for future thought leadership series that will be advertised through the university website and other media, because the role of the universities is also to participate in this discourse. Thank you very much indeed. You must have a wonderful rest of the day. Wonderful afternoon. Thank you for the people in the background, our Lasha Loader from our communications department and our ICT that made sure that we could offer this particular webinar. Thank you very much indeed, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.